Hey everyone, welcome to Unique Ways with Tom Gerard, an audio podcast. Got a really awesome guest on today. He's a designer from Cambridge, UK, and he started creating 3D typography sometime in 2012. He's fascinated by semantics, visual cues, and symbolism, and he's also fascinated by cognitive biases and the readiness of the human brain to be fooled by optical illusion. Please join me in welcoming Lex Wilson. Welcome.
Hey, great to be here, Thomas.
You ready for 20 questions?
I sure am. Let's go.
Okay, question one. Tell me a little bit more about yourself. What do you do?
Well, I have two jobs really. I guess the best catch-all term for one of my jobs would be visual artist, and that work explores type and letter forms in 3D space or in 3D projections. I'm fascinated by type as an object, and also with semantics and double entendres. I use a mix of traditional tools and methods like pencil, ink, paint. I make physical models, but I also use digital tools like Photoshop, Procreate, and 3D modeling software. And then my other role is as a design leader in a sort of corporate marketing setting, where I lead the global creative function. It's a lot less hands-on, more strategic, and I get to work with some really smart people outside the creative fields, engineers, scientists, technologists, marketers. And what I love about that role is the collaboration, the coaching, mentoring, nurturing relationships. And the design decision making is really objective there, particularly around things like UX. Um, so I guess I'd say I'm a design leader because I'm pretty good at it, but I'm a visual artist because I just have to do it.
Great. And just a quick note for the audience, if you're liking the typography angle, definitely check out our most popular episode. It is with Eric Speakerman. Question two, what's a key piece of knowledge that makes you different?
Well, I'm not sure I'm all that different, to be honest. Um, I am fascinated by the psychology research around creativity. Um, for anyone interested in that kind of stuff, I can recommend a book called The Creative Self by Maciej Kowalski and James Kaufman. It's some pretty heavy reading, but one big takeaway is about our belief in our own creativity. So basically, if you think you're creative, you're probably right. If you don't think you're creative, you're probably right. And that creativity is more about freedom and confidence than about any sort of intrinsic talent. It's a sort of freedom to allow ideas to percolate and the confidence to act them out in some way. And that feeds into my practice as an artist and also as a coach and mentor.
Great. And on to number three, why this of all things? Why do you do what you do?
It's a brilliant question. It's one I've been asking myself for a long time, actually. I had no idea what I wanted to do when I left school. I started working as an apprentice in precision engineering, and there was this incredible attention to detail. Like ultimately, it was all about making, about bringing things into the world. And I moved into technical drawing. This was when AutoCAD Inventor, like a 3D drafting software, was really popular in engineering. And I think that's where I got a feel for working with objects in 3D space. And I went on to study industrial design at university in the early 2000s. And back then we were still being taught technical drawing by hand, right? Rendering with markers,
Mm.
understanding light and shadow, how to render different materials like stone or glass or metals. Really cool, but all by hand. And we made models from styrofoam and like pitched ideas to big groups of people. So I learned early on how it felt to have a pitch ripped to shreds, and that's prepared me pretty well for my role as a design leader, where I've had to pitch to some fairly ruthlessly honest people. Um, I'm really into poetry and the sort of weight that words have in different contexts. And I guess really influenced by sort of freestyle MCing and the creative wordplay that you find there. You have to kind of untangle it to find the hidden messages and meanings. And there's this kind of world that words can create in the imagination. So I guess my work is a combination of a kind of engineering-like approach to form, love for words and semantics, and this compulsion to bring ideas to life somehow.
Great. And four, some people struggle with, but the question is, what does your future look like?
Oh, goodness me. I'm gonna get older. I'm definitely gonna get older. Uh, I'm not a big long-term planner, to be honest. Um, it's going to sound a bit corny, but to me, life is something like a river, right? You can learn to swim and you can learn to move around in it, take a different course or tributary when it arises, um, cling to a rock when you have to, right? But the river has its own sort of inexorable path. Um, I guess for me, it's a case of moving in a certain direction every day. Um, but ultimately, though, in future, I'd like to pay it forward. I think expressing ourselves creatively is part of the human experience, and I'd really like to work with others to help them develop their creative self belief, whether that's through teaching or working in therapeutic sessions. I think that's where I'd like to end up.
Great. And five, we say is unique to this show. The question is, let's talk about location. How does the notion of place play into what you do?
Yeah, I love that. Great question. It really depends on what work I'm doing, to be honest. Often the space is more important to me than a particular place. Like when I draw, I just need a small amount of space to set out my tools, and I can do that in most places. I started to use an iPad and Procreate recently, which means I can create almost anywhere. Um, I mean, I've never had a pencil whose battery ran out. I will say that, like the iPads does. So pencil one, iPad zero, I guess. And on the other hand, like my anamorphic work is completely place-based. It's usually mural sized. It relies on the interaction of different surfaces. It's in a specific place, but it's still all about the space. Um, and the space itself is a kind of fundamental component of that work. There are these huge artworks which people can step into, be a part of, interact with, experience fully. That's definitely my favorite type of work to do. And then when I paint, I generally do it from my little studio. I like to keep all that set up, ready to go. There's something about prep, like setting up an easel, brushes, paint, etc., that sort of killed my creative vibe a bit. So that's very place based. So I'd say location is pretty important to me, but it tends to be of logistical importance rather than anything emotive.
Great. And six, if you had to start from the beginning, what advice would you give your former younger self?
Ooh. Um, I guess I'd tell myself that perfection doesn't exist. Um, to make a start and carry on. Um, and show your workings. I spent a lot of time sort of starting and never finishing work, or starting and throwing away something because it didn't kind of meet some ideal I had of perfection in my work. And looking back, I should have shared everything I did as a kind of journaling, like warts and all.
Great. And seven, what's a day in your life like?
Well, I've got a dog, and we walk for about 2 or 3 miles every morning. I get the sun in my eyes and air in my lungs. And I do most of my creative thinking when I'm not at a desk. I heard it said that when we're engaged in like mundane tasks like walking or showering or washing dishes or whatever, that's when the quote unquote heavy machinery of the subconscious whirs into action. And that's certainly true for me. I find it's when I'm doing those kinds of subconscious things that I get all my ideas. And then after my walk, I start my job as a design leader. And in the evenings and weekends, I tend to practice my craft. So I don't have a lot of downtime, but I'd say my visual art is great downtime for me. It's a time to escape structure and rules and boundaries.
Great. And eight, lifelong learning is a popular topic. How do you stay up to date?
I'm not sure I do keep up to date, to be honest. As an artist, um, a lot of the techniques I use are traditional, right? I think I'm subconsciously trying to keep it that way, probably. Um, in terms of using modern technology, it's generally only to make my craft more immediate or portable, like using the iPad or whatever. Um, when it comes to design leadership, I read a ton, and I'm fortunate enough to work in a really sort of forward-facing environment where we're integrating AI into our processes. We're measuring the impact of creative work we produce and making incremental improvements. And that element of objectivity is something I really enjoy. It's a nice balance to my visual art, which really only has to please me and which I don't measure by engagement or clicks or responses. So it's a nice balance.
Great. And nine is around tools. Can you talk about specific digital and analog tools?
Sure. I use a bunch of really basic tools, so pencils, a ruler, eraser, pairs of compasses, paint, canvas and brushes, spray paint, the messy stuff, all the messy stuff.
Mm.
Um, in terms of tech, I have been known to use a light box if I'm feeling really futuristic. Uh, for my anamorphic work that in really large spaces, I'll use a projector. But the iPad has been my only real attempt at becoming fully nomadic with my illustration. I just prefer working freehand.
Great. And halfway, number 10, how do you deal with work life or life work balance?
It's always been a challenge. Um, for me, it's just been a case of being really disciplined, knowing when to shut off, being careful about where I spend my time. Um, Recently, I've made an effort to really focus on whatever I'm doing. So I've spent many years thinking about my visual art when I was at work or thinking about work when I was doing my visual art. And I've learned to partition my different activities so that I can give my full focus to each thing.
Mm.
Um, and that seems to be working really well for me.
Great. And if you weren't doing what you do now, what might you be doing?
I think I'd be an educator.
Mm.
Um, the great Brian Eno, he's quoted as saying, um, children learn through play, adults play through art.
Mm.
And I always loved that. I think there's a lot we can learn from finding ways to communicate and express ourselves visually.
Mm.
And I'd love to be a part of that process with people.
Mm. What would you not like to do with your career?
Well, I really like to solve problems. Uh, and one of the things I coach in new designers is to learn to feel comfortable with a challenge, sit with a problem, make friends with it, right? Don't be in a rush to solve it.
Mm.
So I think anything really repetitive or with a really obvious solution wouldn't suit me very well. I like the challenge of a problem and to spend a bit of time finding a solution to it.
Do you have a favorite word, quote, or sentence?
Yeah, well, Escher is one of my great MC Escher, the graphic artist who created those bonkers kind of labyrinths where the ground is on the ceiling and the stairs are all over the place and the water flows uphill. He's got this quote. Um, I think it's in my basement. Let me go upstairs and check. And I love that. It's kind of silly and nonsensical, right?
Mm.
And a bit throwaway, but it's so authentic to the way he approached his work. So that's my favorite quote.
How about a least favorite word, quote, or sentence?
It will do.
Mm.
Uh, I'm not I'm not a big fan of sort of scraping by with the minimum. I like to try to take pride in everything.
And if you had to choose one word to describe yourself, what word would it be?
Pernickety, probably. I'm a stickler for details.
Mm. What keeps you up at night?
Ideas usually.
Mm.
Well, more specifically, it's the fear that I'll forget an idea by the morning if I don't work on it there and then. Um, so they sort of sit there burning in the dead of night, and I worry they'll turn to ash by the morning. So sometimes I get out of bed and sketch the thing down, or create some aid memoir that I know won't go away. I guess I just don't trust my memory overnight.
Great. And final stretch here. What's a dream you're chasing?
I probably already answered it. I'd like to teach or support others to find their creative voice.
Do you have something that inspires you?
I think MC Escher, who I mentioned earlier, is probably my
Mm.
biggest influence. My mum, she's also an artist. She gave me a book on my 12th or 13th birthday. It's a collection of his graphic works. I've still got it now. I just remember it just completely blew my mind.
Mm.
His work is just so out there,
Mm.
but it was kind of underpinned by this incredible technical brilliance. His execution was just flawless.
Mm.
Super wacky, but really precise. Just
Mm.
awesome. And I also really like Felice Varini and George Roos, both pioneers of kind of incredible anamorphic work in urban architectural spaces, just mind-blowing stuff. And also I like Patrick Hughes, a fellow Brit artist who does sort of reverse perspective art pieces in galleries, which are you kind of move around them and they totally twist your melon,
Mm.
so to speak.
Great. And 19, any advice you'd like to share?
Just to play, I think, just to play. I think it's fundamental to the human experience, and it's often thought of as frivolous, right? But it can be goal oriented too. And I think it's part of what it means to be an artist or a designer. Um, but I've found you need to carve out time for the kind of play that truly liberates creativity. So play, yeah, play more.
Great. And finally, number 20, how can our listeners keep tabs on you? What's our call to action?
My website at lexwilson.co.uk is woefully out of date, so the best place to find me is on Instagram at
Mhm.
Lex Wilson Type, or at YouTube at Lex Wilson. And I'm also on LinkedIn as Lex Wilson, head of creative.
Great. Well, thanks so much for joining today. It's super interesting to see the typographic world in the podcast kind of expand and go in different directions. And yours is definitely one of those. Thank you so much for joining today.
Really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot, Thomas, and thanks for having me.